So as Benedict XVI has suggested, Matteo Ricci had a particular gift at cultural dialogue. But that gift was for Ricci entirely dedicated to sowing the gospel seed. That's the Holy Father's statement. One other thing I should say, just in terms of his history, since I'm a historian, that Ricci was not the first person to really adopt this what so-called accommodationist approach. It really, the accommodationist approach was in fact inherited from his fellow Jesuit, Michel Ruggieri, who taught him to adapt Catholicism to Chinese language and traditions rather than make Europeans of the native Chinese. I've mentioned that already. But it was Ruggieri who really sort of began that process, that idea of accommodation. Ricci really sort of mastered that. The Ricci method, as it's called, was really little more than adapting the teachings of the Church to Chinese society, of accommodating Catholic devotional and liturgical life to Chinese sensibilities. One point that was mentioned in the introduction was that the Summa Theologicae was partially translated by Ludovico Buglio, who was actually one of the sort of lead Jesuits in Beijing. And he also spent 20 years, incidentally, because of Ricci, he spent 20 years translating the Missale Romana, the Missal. Just let me throw this out, by the way. Translating the Roman Missal of the Tridentine Rite, if you want to call it that, into Chinese. And some people say, well, it was in classical Chinese. Well, that's actually not true. It was in part classical, part vernacular. Actually, for a while, historically, this is true. The Mass, after Ricci's death, was in Chinese. And it wasn't until later that the Pope, it's interesting, people are sort of discovering this now, that the Pope said, well, let's just keep it in Latin, right? So there was this moment that Rome understood and knew that China was different, but there were these efforts made by the Jesuits to translate the Mass into Chinese, to translate text into Chinese, and to basically sinify, and that's the word, sinify Catholicism. One of the larger accusations that people made was that, today in fact, is that Ricci in the end wasn't truly Catholic, right? Some people quote that in the Second Vatican Council, where it says that other religions, quote, often reflect a ray of truth, that which enlightens all men, that Ricci wasn't in fact, I'm just sort of defending Ricci right now, that he wasn't in fact using Chinese religions in a sense, how do I say, he wasn't essentially using Confucianism and other Chinese religions in a way to promote Catholicism, but that he was misrepresenting Catholicism in terms of using these other languages, or using the language in Buddhist texts and Confucian texts. So I just want to say that when Ricci first arrived, and scholars are often saying, well, when he first arrived, he dressed up like a Buddhist, and that's true, he did. He first arrived, he noticed that there were these other religious people who wore robes, that they had abbots, that they had nuns, that they prayed with beads, and that the local officials said, well, you must be Buddhist, because Buddhists were the only other religious group who actually had this idea of an afterlife. Confucianism didn't have an idea of an afterlife at all. In fact, when Confucius was asked, is there an afterlife, he said, and I think this is sort of a wise response, Confucius said, I don't understand life. How can I understand the afterlife? Like, I don't know this. How can I know that? So what Confucius said was, I won't deny it. I just don't know it. He wasn't also living in a context with the benefit of revelation, of Scripture. So there was no other religious group that had an ideal of an afterlife. So when the Jesuits first arrived, yes, Ricci did put on the habit of a Buddhist. And he was happy to accept land for the Jesuits that was affixed to the Buddhist monastery. Yet, Ricci wasn't doing it without understanding Buddhism. He studied Buddhism and was very quick to become one of the most adamant critics of Buddhist ideas. In fact, what Ricci finally sort of concluded, I think rightly so, and that is that Buddhists are probably among the most difficult people to have dialogue with because of this ontological problem of truth. This idea that we, in a sense, essentially, we don't exist. So Ricci wasn't a Buddhist, and he abandoned the Buddhist habit as soon as he understood it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, when you hear, oh, Ricci wore a Buddhist habit, because I've heard this at talks before, he was really becoming more Buddhist. No, he wore the Buddhist habit only at first, in as much as he thought there might be similarities. The other point I want to make, too, is that Ricci studied Confucianism, in a sense, to understand the terms so that he could produce texts that would be appealing to Confucians, that would perhaps nudge them toward an understanding of the Christian religion. So he wrote, his most famous work was the book called The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, the Tianzhu Shiyi, in which he stages an imaginary debate between a Chinese scholar, a Zhongshi, and a Western scholar, a Xishi. So in a sense, he's mastering Confucianism to publish a work. And I think when you read his journals, he's thinking about this. If I understand Confucianism, I can publish debates between Confucians and Western scholars. So between this Zhongshi, this Chinese scholar, and the Xishi, this Western scholar, throughout the work, one sees that the Confucian is brilliant. He really does portray every Confucian tenet sort of in an organized fashion. But the Western scholar reputes everything. And interestingly enough, when you study Chinese history, the predominant number of people who were converted to Christianity were converted, what? Because they read that work. Sure, he published a map. Sure, he published works on Euclidean geometry and other texts. But this text was actually, this one in his essay on friendship, were his most famous texts. So Ricci's mastery of Confucianism allowed him to publish a debate that was very much responsible for the conversion of many Chinese. In addition to that, the Emperor Kangxi wrote an edict of toleration for Christianity, saying that Christianity could be promulgated all over China, precisely because the emperor himself had read Ricci's Tianzhu Shiyi, the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven. Well, let me just wind down because it's already after 4. At the end of his Tianzhu Shiyi, it should be noted, right, just to defend him again. And part of my lecture today is to try to tell you just how really Christian Ricci was and how truly Catholic he was, not just a scientist. You should know that at the end of that debate between the Western scholar and the Confucian, there's a very clear passage where he basically notes that in the church there is this idea of baptism, right? There's a sacred water, and one must be baptized in the sacred water to be released from original sin, and that in Confucianism, our bodies belong to our parents, right? That's an important point. That's why you have to be buried whole in China. Our bodies belong to our parents. But at the very end of the Tianzhu Shiyi, he says we must be baptized, we must realize that we have original sin, and that we belong to God, to Tianzhu, not to our parents. That we should be respectful, but there's certainly an apologetic ending of the Tianzhu Shiyi that is seldom conjured.